The Dig is a podcast produced in conjunction with Jacobin magazine, which you probably figured out by now. And yes, Jacobin is a print publication, not just your favorite source of online commentary, but also long-form serious print journalism and socialist analysis. The magazine is released quarterly, and it runs at around 130 pages, filled with award-winning design and the ideas that movements need to thrive. Dig listeners can join more than 50,000 Jacobin subscribers supporting this vital work for just $15 a year. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's very extensive archive online. First-time subscribers only, you can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin, all in lowercase. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Matthew Countryman writes, quote, "Historians of Black Power have tended to depict the movement as consisting of a series of pronouncements from national figures like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, Huey Newton and Maulana Karenga, Angela Davis and Kathleen Cleaver. Similarly, conventional accounts of the period of civil rights struggle that preceded Black Power's rise are often stripped down to a set of iconic figures and moments. Mostly in the 1950s and 60s, mostly in the Deep South. But what Countryman shows is that the Black freedom struggle was both long in time and nationwide in scope, and more specifically, that Black struggle was for decades an explosive and dynamic force at the center of Philadelphia politics. National politics in general, and the Southern movement in particular, of course, loomed large, and they powerfully shaped local movements. But local movements in cities like Philly were also profoundly just that, local. This is the subject of Countryman's remarkable 2006 book, Up South, Civil Rights and Black Power in Philadelphia. And it's what I'm interviewing Countryman about in this episode. Philly is a city that is very, very dear to me, and Up South is one of my favorite books ever. I've wanted to do a show on it for a long time, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to reread it to prepare for this interview. Up South traces the history of Black Philly politics beginning in the early 20th century, when Black people made up just a small proportion of the city's population, just 5.5% in 1910, an era when Black and white activists came to embrace the creed of racial liberalism, the notion that progressive integration would progressively chip away at white people's irrational bigotry. But as the Great Migration grew the city's Black population, from 11% in 1930 to 18% in 1950, 26% in 1960, and more than 33% in 1970, racial liberalism's promise was increasingly revealed to be an empty one for the city's working class and poor Black masses. Black people were not just excluded from jobs thanks to overt discrimination and bigotry. There was a newly expansive system of residential segregation that trapped Black people in ghettos in places like North Philly, and so also relegated them to second-class schools as jobs and white people fled to rapidly growing whites-only suburban developments that funded their own first-class schools close to those good jobs. What happened next was that a dizzying array and far from homogeneous set of new models for Black politics, often steeped in militancy and Black power, emerged to fill the void as it became clear that racial liberalism and middle-class moderate interracialism had failed. From aggressive mass pickets targeting racially exclusionary construction unions and black capitalism to revolutionary nationalism and welfare rights, black people in Philadelphia sought to secure power in the city. All at the very moment when suburbanization and deindustrialization meant that access to substantive power in the city was fast disappearing. And white reaction exploded too, embodied in Philly in the city's brutal and demagogic police commissioner turned mayor, Frank Rizzo, a proto-Trumpian figure who promised that law and order would secure society against black threats. I can't summarize it all here, but ultimately, the story is about the rise of a new black political class, which won, in significant part, a Pyrrhic victory of political power in cities at the very moment that cities lost control of much of a region's taxable wealth, all while state and national politics took a hard right turn. The forces of deindustrialization, suburbanization, and segregation operated and continue to operate at these much larger regional, national, and global scales over which poor black people have little control. The story Countryman tells in Up South is really the history of the present moment, where police and prisons regulate the boundaries of a hyper-segregated, unequal, economically deprived, and exclusionary metropolis. A situation that has this year prompted nationwide revolts from Philly to Minneapolis and all over the place. Up South is an essential book to read right now, and I encourage you to join a Dig book club and read Up South with fellow Dig listeners. Dig book club members will then meet with Matthew Countryman on Zoom on September 12th to discuss the book. If you'd like to join a Dig book club and meet with Countryman, visit thedigradio.com/dig-book-club to sign up. That's thedigradio/dig-book-club. Finally, briefly, before we get moving on this interview, this podcast only exists because so many of you who listen to it support us with monthly contributions at patreon.com/thedig. We put no episodes behind a paywall because we are deeply committed to everyone, regardless of their ability to pay, having access to these interviews. Our listenership has grown substantially during the pandemic, and I'm really grateful that you all find these analyses so useful to understanding the world in your quest to transform it. So, if you can afford to support us, we need you to do so. What's more, if you contribute at least $10 a month, we will send you a free left-wing book or books in the mail as a thank you. If you care about this podcast and you can afford to, please contribute what you can at patreon.com/thedig. The website is pretty self-explanatory and it'll only take you a few minutes to figure it out. That's patreon.com/thedig. Thanks, and here's Matthew Countryman, chair of the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, where he is also a professor of Afro-American Studies and History. In addition to Up South, Civil Rights and Black Power in Philadelphia, he is currently working on a book about the role of African-American mayors in national debates on race and poverty in the late 20th century. Matthew Countryman, welcome to The Dig.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
From liberal reforms of the 1940s and 50s to mass action in the early 60s to Black Power in the late 60s through the 70s, Philadelphia, which was for a very long time the nation's third largest city, it was consumed by conflict over race, class, power. And I don't think that's very often remembered, including, I suspect, by many Philadelphians. What was the conventional historiography of the civil rights movement, and what do we instead see when we expand our timeline and diversify our geographic focus? What, in other words, does a longer story and wider lens reveal about Black politics and struggle in the 20th century that is otherwise obscured?
Well, for the longest time, the historiography of the Civil Rights Movement was of a Southern movement, one that began, depending on your narrative, either with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in '54 or the Montgomery bus boycott 2 years later. And it was a narrative of triumph in the South based in Martin Luther King's leadership and in the vision of a integrated society, and on the promise of nonviolent protest. That culminates in the federal legislation in 1964 and '65, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and then is distorted or undercut by the militancy, the racial anger of the North, and particularly the focus on Black power. That narrative remains powerful. People still adhere to it. I do think that the Black Lives Matter movement has begun to move it in certain important ways. But at the time I was starting my research, that was the dominant understanding. To the extent to which one might talk about the North, one would talk about Black power as this kind of disruptive, almost declension and declining, the disruption of the movement. But even that was not necessarily seen as all that important. In fact, I had colleagues who couldn't get their books published that were focused on Black power activism in the North because it wasn't seen as interesting to or useful to understanding the movement. What I hope to do in my book is to recast the civil rights movement not as a regional movement, but as a national movement whose origins preceded, in fact, the Montgomery bus boycott. In fact, you couldn't have that kind of a Southern movement start unless there was something happened before. At least as early as the 1941 March on Washington movement led by A. Philip Randolph for equal employment rights in wartime production industries. And that is always a national movement. It's always addressing the ways in which race is distorting of the American promise and denying full citizenship rights to African Americans, or in the lingo of the day, Negroes. What a Philadelphia focus does is to show us how that took place at the local level, how, in fact, because of Southern power in Congress, it was a movement that could only achieve its goals through local action, and which demonstrated that the impact that civil rights legislation could have, first at the local level, but also then began to run up against the limitations of that legislative achievement in northern cities. And it's that struggle that leads to the increasing militancy of the movement, not just of Black power, but even the militancy or the increasingly radicalization of the demands of Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the late 1960s, and then the emerging demands of a Black political class for a full stake in the political institutions of the society.
One key thing along these lines that histories like yours and Tom Sugrew's Origins of the Urban Crisis show is that the racially conservative white reaction began far earlier than the 1970s and 80s. And so it wasn't this inevitable reaction to the excesses of Black power in the New Left. In fact, what you show is that it took root in these very concrete conflicts over the Great Migration and Black struggle for what are now considered to be the pretty minimal, ordinary demands of the civil rights movement for neighborhood, workplace, and school integration. This seems really important today, given how much left and racial justice organizing tends to be critiqued and evaluated on the basis of its potential for prompting or eliciting right-wing reaction.
I think this is a crucial point, and one that actually the history helps us understand a lot better. It goes without saying that the Southern system of de jure segregation and the racial violence that underpinned it was, on a day-to-day basis, much more oppressive than anything that was significantly more oppressive, right? And it's why people left, in part, right? They left for economic opportunity to go north in the Great Migration, but they also left because the rule of law did not apply to Black life in the South. But that fact masked the ways in which the Northern racial system was as anti-democratic and was deeply oppressive and denying of Black opportunity. And so, as a society, we have tisked racial segregation in the South as a way to, in fact, evade the persistence and the pervasiveness of racial segregation through space, as opposed to through law that takes place in the North. That's a system that begins to evolve in the 1920s, that is established in the post-war moment through white flight and suburbanization, and then is reproduced generation after generation since. And we celebrate the places it has been somewhat reduced, but do so at the peril of ignoring its persistence and depth of its commitment. Politically, what that's meant among Northern whites, right, is that, again, that tisking of Southern racism and of what Ku Klux Klans and hoods and explicit racial bias has allowed for significant parts of the white polity in the North, liberal and conservative, to downplay their own investment in racial segregation in their communities, but in their schools and in their workplaces.
What is this narrative about left generally and Black particularly movement excess being the cause of white reaction? What does that conventional wisdom convey, and what does the actual history show?
Right. It in part it defines Black demand not as a desire for the application of democratic principles across racial lines. Even if taking on the at face value the promises of democratic capitalism, it redefines Black demand as excessive, as seeking special favor, as demanding retribution or compensance, rather than the full promises of the American century and of this idea of the American promise. But it's also, I think, what's extraordinary is the kind of ability to look at Black aspiration through a dual lens, where when it's against explicit forms of bias and prejudice, as the Southern form, to position oneself as supporting it, even as one opposes as excessive the demands that change happen in one's own workplace, one's own neighborhood, one's own school district. And so that dichotomy in white politics, and here to give the liberal version of the present moment, right, the ways in which even liberal college towns, people are all horrified by police violence, but they see their own police forces, which are really undifferentiated in terms of who makes them and what their policies are from these places that did these terrible things, as fair and trustworthy and protecting us. And so that notion of protecting us and protecting what we have achieved cuts across ideological grounds in white politics in this society, and has done so consistently since the World War II era.
Let's step back to the beginning of your story chronologically. Black political power in early 20th century Philly really emerges in part from party competition for a Black vote that's suddenly growing quite quickly. And in 1928, you have Herbert Hoover, a Republican, obviously, winning overwhelming support in Black precincts. But then less than a decade later, in 36 and then in 40, Black support goes overwhelmingly to FDR. How did the New Deal, both nationally and in its particular concrete local form, help create the liberal coalition in general and the liberal civil rights coalition in particular that emerged in Philly? And to what degree was it the liberal economic agenda, the New Deal economic agenda, that made this coalition a reality? And to what extent was it the result of local Democrats' support for civil rights measures, like a ban on segregation and public accommodations, that Republicans who had controlled so much of the Black vote refused to support?
So, it's I think a fairly nuanced and complicated story to try to tease out those different aspects. The first thing I'll say is that we have to understand the New Deal as, a product of a Democratic Party. It was not ideologically liberal in the ways we would understand it today, but rather a coalition of a range of forces and which explicitly implements the New Deal with the promise to its Southern supporters that it will not disrupt the racial system of the South. What that means to Northern blacks, right, is I think that first of all, people understand that, right? There's no illusions about what the Democratic Party has become, but rather there's a sense here that we are being included, even in some ways partially. This is not full inclusion, this is not racially equitable, but it is inclusion in some of these economic initiatives, particularly things like the WPA and other places, for the first time. Right, the federal government is for the first time offering to include us in programs that are saving the nation, right, and particularly saving working people. These are not perfect programs, but they are a huge difference, right? And so that's, I think, the primary force that brings blacks to vote for FDR. I mean, that's what he offers them. But it is another stage for a local party, a state party in Pennsylvania, to win black votes, particularly because Pennsylvania and Philadelphia were Republican machine states, right? So what the Republican machine at the time offered was patronage, and it wasn't, much. This goes back to W.B. Du Bois's work on the Philadelphia Negro early in the 20th century, right? What blacks are getting through these political clubhouses, the Republican is not a lot. These are a little bit of money on election day, part-time, or day labor jobs. I mean, these are not what other parts of the community are getting, but they are significant and necessary resources.
Second-class patronage, but patronage nonetheless.
Exactly. Yeah, well put. And so to win black voters from that at the state and local level, first of all, it's a generational project, right? So black votes tend to go to Democrats in state elections for state representatives and the governorship by the late 30s. It takes until the late 40s to get those votes in the city, in Philadelphia city elections. But to get those votes, that's where black voters demand and black political leaders demand, at least symbolically, civil rights action, right? So the Democrats in Pennsylvania state legislature do what the Republicans had refused to do, which is to pass a law banning segregation in public accommodations in the mid-1930s. And that is crucial to not only winning black votes for governor, but actually to them slotting and winning majority black state house seats in Philadelphia in 1936 and 38. And then the same thing will happen finally in the late 40s, when sort of the shifts of the New Deal finally create the conditions where the Democratic Party, which had been really an appendage of the Republican Party in the city of Philadelphia until the mid-1940s, it was really literally run by the same machine operation that ran the Republican Party, finally breaks that organizational hold. And when it's clear that the Democrats can win local elections, then black votes again shift over, because but they do that on a civil rights agenda, right? So this Philadelphia Democratic Party announces its support, particularly through the appointment of black civil rights attorney Sadie Alexander to President Truman's Civil Rights Committee in 1946. That support for a civil rights agenda becomes crucially important to winning over black votes in the city and to the establishment, right, of Philadelphia as a democratic city, in which, based on the votes of black voters, based on the votes of white liberals, and based on the votes and the support of white-led trade unions, that three-part support, it all has to happen at the same time, and that's what happened in the late 1940s.
Another key piece of context for this era are the two world wars, which shaped Black Philly dramatically, shaped the entirety of Philly dramatically, of course, but drew huge numbers of migrants from the South to work in the city's defense-related industries. But the two wars really shaped Black politics in pretty different ways. During World War I, you had leaders like Du Bois who thought that patriotic fervor in Black people doing their part would lead to progress, which is not at all what happened. Black workers were met with violence on the streets when they sought housing outside of the overcrowded South Philly slum, and also attempting to get jobs, including this 1917 lynching of a Black man hired to work at the South Philly Naval Shipyard, who was lynched by a mob that included uniformed soldiers. And then, in contrast, civil rights activists during World War II took on the Double V, or Double Victory program, to defeat fascism abroad and racism at home. And so in 1944, Black workers were in this very different position. For example, Black workers on Philly's trolley and subway system had support from the CIO and from FDR, who came in and broke a hate strike against integrating the workforce. How did the two world wars shape Black Philly politics in such different ways? And relatedly, what accounts for such different Black politics during the two different wars?
Well, I think the story. I mean, the answer to the second part of the question is probably has as much to do with the status of national Black leadership at the different times, but also they have to do with the differences between a moment in which we can now look back on as scientific racism, right? The idea that in fact Blacks are not only are Blacks biologically inferior, but therefore it is logical in a democratic society to treat them as less than full citizens, right, and to deny them, in practice, if not by the Constitution, the right to vote. So the logic that folks like Du Bois are pursuing at the time, right, is premised on the fact that they have very little, almost no political power, right. That Black communities, with the exception of the South Side of Chicago and a little bit of Harlem at that point, really are not large enough outside of the South to have any political influence. They're really dependent on the goodwill of the white political system, and the only only possibility, right, is to essentially claim citizenship based on service. I mean, that's what Du Bois is doing when he urges African Americans to close ranks in support of democracy, on the promise that later we will demonstrate our service to the nation and we will be rewarded. It is, obviously deeply ironic and in some ways tragic. I mean, always tragic, right? The level of violence that's then brought back onto Black communities, both in the war years, as the 1917 incident you described, but even more so when the Black soldiers returned from Europe. And Philadelphia is just, this is the Red Summer of 1919 in Chicago. You have white soldiers in uniform murdering Blacks in front of the White House in 1919. You have the court-martialing of Black troops in Texas. It is a pogrom that is exercised on Black communities in the North after World War I, and they lack the political resources to resist. They do resist as best as possible, but it's really a devastating time, and it's and linked directly to the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan as a Northern political force in the 1920s, and that legacy lasts. I mean, that's a generational process. As late as 1938, the FBI is reporting that there were tens of thousands of members of pro-Nazi organizations in Pennsylvania. So, this is we need to rediscover just the power of that racist right-wing politics of the 1920s and 30s, because so much of it seems to be returning to us a century later. World War II, though, is different, and that is in part the work of the civil rights community through the 20s and 30s, in part an academic movement to discredit biological racism, and that has some crucial impact. In part, the reaction to, in large part, the reaction to Nazism and the ways in which, quite explicitly, Hitler's racial regime was based on the American model. All of these things are crucial and particularly lead to real significant shifts in American liberalism.
Because you have the Second World War, which is the kind of New Deal government's war against fascism abroad. And this is simplistic, but this is kind of the vibe, rather than Woodrow Wilson nakedly kind of racist war,
sure,
tied up in the imperialism and reaction of the time. And so you have the first war steeped in reactionary politics, and the second war, in a variety of complicated ways, does unleash a lot more progressive currents.
Well, and you're right. And I think Wilson is a Democrat. He believes in democracy, but it's a white man's democracy, right? As much as he wants to, it's the war to save democracy. It's the democracy of it's a white-only democracy that he's trying to say. In contrast, right, the evidence of the racialism of Nazism is now identified as its most important characteristic of its anti-democratic nature. And in part, that's because, of course, it's raging its racism on Jews and other European minorities, but also because so much of that biological racist project has been discredited through the activism in the United States, through intellectual work. I mean, a figure like Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish sociologist, who is brought to comes to the U.S. brought by the Carnegie Foundation to study the race problems. And his interpretation that, in fact, racialism is a direct threat to democracy. It's not and that's the difference. Wilson sees racialism as the basis of democracy.
Right.
For Myrdal and, increasingly important figures in American liberalism, racism becomes the primary threat to the democratic tradition. And Myrdal's work, right, which suggests that it's not the presence of Black people that threatens American democracy, not their bodies, but rather the racist attitudes of whites, is a crucial shift in American ideological understandings of race. Not particularly news, obviously, to the African American civil rights community, who've been making this point for a long, long time. But great, very much appreciated, and makes possible the rise of an interracial movement for civil rights. That had been a very marginal project in 1909 when Du Bois and other Black leaders joined with white socialists and neo-abolitionists to form the NAACP. But with it's a tiny organization, and they have almost no ability to recruit whites to it. Right, fundamentally different, just a generation later.
Well, the political context was so different by World War II that in 1945, a left-wing slate tied to the communist-aligned Popular Front took over the Philadelphia NAACP in an attempt to create a base among the Black working class masses. And this created a brutal conflict with the sort of middle-class moderate leadership and ultimately to the left's defeat. Where did World War II era liberals and leftists affiliated with the communist back groups like the National Negro Congress, where did they differ on civil rights? And how did the transition from World War II and the New Deal era into the Cold War shape the fight over Black politics in Philly?
So I think to answer the question, we actually have to step back a little bit to another aspect of the story that we didn't tell about 1930s, right, which is the rise of the CIO. And, deeply influenced by, I would argue by communist activism in the early 30s, as documented by Mark Nason in Harlem and Robin Kelly in Alabama, but also, embracing anti-communist socialist traditions of trade unionism, liberal traditions of trade unionism. The CIO becomes really the most respected force for racial change in Black communities in the late 1930s, precisely because, again, it's including Black workers in its project. It's in fact suggesting that industrial unionism will only triumph if it is if it's an interracial movement. So that, on the one hand, suggests, right, that across a broad swath of liberalism on the left, there are some common shared principles, and those shared principles include labor rights, but they also include democratic rights for African Americans. But throughout that history, right, there are real tensions, and there are tensions, over everything, over organizational style, over strategy, over relationships to the Soviet Union. I mean, there's just a lot of different tensions, and so in that sense, the history of the National Negro Congress, which becomes the primary vehicle for that, what we have come to call the Popular Front, or that sort of CIO style racial unity for liberal causes in the late 1930s. It first breaks down when A. Philip Randolph, a socialist but anti-communist trade unionist, denounces the organization, resigns as president of it, in the tensions that are emerging over the European War, and the role of the Soviet Union there in 1939, reconvenes then after 1941 when the Hitler-Stalin Pact collapses and the Soviets join the Allies in the war, which reinvigorates the possibility of those kinds of alliances. And as that's all happening, Randolph is leading this campaign, the March on Washington movement in 1941. He remains, publicly opposed, but he's quite, he's to alliance with the communist movement. But the local level, much of the March on Washington movement is much more a Popular Front move, and the demands of that movement the plan for an all-Black march on D.C. and forcing FDR to issue his executive order banning racial discrimination in defense plans sets the stage there for the kind of coalition politics, but also the kind of protest politics that becomes the kind of characteristic of post-war Popular Front civil rights activism. And at its peak in the period of 45 and 46, there's strong liberal investment in that. And that's where you see these kind of broad coalitions in places like Philadelphia that include the NAACP, but also include much more left-wing forces. As quickly as that emerges, it also begins to crumble. And it crumbles, and really, again, because of the Cold War and the post-war politics of empire. And as liberals become more and more squeamish about working with more left-wing forces, in part because of disagreements over the international situation, disagreements over strategy. The left is much more interested in mass protest. Liberals would rather work through the electoral system, work through elites, connecting through kind of advocacy organizations, top-down organizations. But I think most fundamentally, it's simply that the left becomes toxic for anybody who's not part of it, right? If you're not, there's so much anti-communist rhetoric in American society that the very alliances that had been crucial to victories and during the war and really after the war begin to be seen by non-communist activists as too costly, and there's a kind of movement away. What's interesting to me about that moment, as you point out, right, is that things like this left-wing alliance that maintains leadership of the Philippine NAACP through to 51, and this is similar kinds of things happen in some of the local trade unions in places like Detroit and UAW unions, is that within the Black community, this left-wing coalition politics remains deeply popular, and in fact able to win the arguments within these civil rights organizations as to what's the best approach. And liberals are the ones, as in the Philippine NAACP, who are forced out because they will not continue to, they won't participate in this kind of popular front coalition politics for a time, right? Until eventually Cold War anti-communist rhetoric just becomes too powerful and those institutions become too powerful. But the second piece that's interesting is that there's huge strategic differences between these two, between the left wing and the liberals over civil rights. And there's obviously important ideological differences over, things like capitalism versus communism or socialism. But programmatically, when it comes to achieving racial equity in the United States, they don't really disagree that much. They're all in favor of equal employment legislation, so fair employment practices legislation. They're focused on anti-lynching activism as a way to deal with the South. They really don't disagree on program. There are ideological disagreements, and then there are these important strategic differences.
You write that racial liberalism, with the stigmatization and marginalization of the left, becomes the dominant force in civil rights in the city. You write, quote, "This constitutionalist stand that blacks and other racial minorities benefit more from efforts to protect individual rights than from efforts to promote group interests came to form the core of civil rights liberalism." And you write that this ideology was dominant during the New Deal, I think, both amongst leftists and liberals. Ironically, it framed advancing equal access and rights to private property, home ownership, small businesses, college education. It framed these things as necessary to protect individuals from capitalism's harms, something very different, you write, from Western Europe's welfare states. How did American political economy, the distinctive, not really a welfare state system built by the New Deal, how did that help shape racial liberalism, a form of anti-racism that was so individualist instead of structural?
So I think that does take us into the New Deal and to the particularities of the New Deal's most popular program, which is Social Security, and the definition of it not as a pension program delivered through the wealth of the society, but rather as an individual account system in which one is rewarded. The taxes that are taken out as one works are metaphorically, not actually, but metaphorically held in some kind of individual account that you can eventually draw on in your retirement. So that's an entirely political justification for a program that is financed just as any other pension program is financed by a state, right? State-based pension program. But it generates this idea that the way you have social welfare is on the model of individual rights, right? On the model of the Bill of Rights in that sense, that one as an individual citizen has a set of rights that the state is bound to protect or deliver on. And it seems to me very clear that for liberals in the wake of the New Deal and World War II, the way to make the case for the use of federal power to protect civil rights. And I emphasize federal power there because this is the shift here. This is the idea that rather than treating race relations as a local condition that's determined in local communities, which is largely the rhetoric of states' rights going back to the 19th century. The argument here is that it's the individual's relationship to the federal state, as rooted in the Bill of Rights, but as modeled in some ways by the New Deal and by things like Social Security and other kinds of, even the GI Bill, right, which is you get state rights, state resources based on your service to the nation, not based on your, on a kind of universal idea of citizenship. That liberal activists take on both to put themselves in the American tradition, right? So we're not advocating some socialism or something different from the American tradition. We are simply saying there are some fundamental rights that the federal government's role is to protect individuals there. And this is the way to overcome the arguments of, explicitly by Southern states, but also in Northern communities, that somehow the federal government has no role on these issues, right? These are our local relationships. But it's also, of course, very effective as a way to, and again, there's important similarities to today, right? To make claims for activism and federal action without identifying oneself with this counter-socialist, foreign tradition. And so given the logic of anti-communism, right, to distinguish oneself from the statist politics of Eastern Europe or even Western Europe, right, the argument here is we're not asking for group rights or something particular, but really simply our citizenship rights as individual American citizens. And that becomes a crucial part of the liberal case. What's interesting to me about that is the ways in which, as you said, particularly in the trade union movement, leftists also support that idea. And here I think it has to do with a kind of the ways in which, the left and trade unions in particular want to emphasize the shared interests of the working class, not the differences, but the ethnic and racial differences within the working class.
Which thus limits sort of like an analysis of the racialized structure of American capitalism.
More than limits, it largely it undercuts
for the left as well, for the left as much as liberals, ironically.
Exactly, and so that when, in fact, again, I having done some research on the UAW when I was earlier, there's a continual demand being made by black members of the UAW for a black member of the international UAW International Board, and the response always is, we don't create black seats.
We're colorblind.
We're colorblind, right? And that, now there are important counters to this within the left. So I don't mean to say the entire left.
Sure. Obviously,
the black left has a different perspective on this, and there are important figures in the white left who reject this too. But the dominant position through this period and into the late 20th century is, that working class organizations are colorblind. That's what the goal of racial inclusion requires, is that kind of colorblind focus. And it does mean there's a kind of, it casts a blind eye to racial internal discrimination and inequities within the labor movement. It also casts a blind eye to racism among the white working class, because you don't challenge people who, as long as they'll tolerate, someplace else, the presence of blacks or whatever, you never have to confront them on their own presumptions of that this is a white, organization. The story that black radicals in the UAW in the late 1960s redefined the meaning of UAW as "you ain't white," as a way of pointing at the kind of institutional racism within the union.
It's a really fascinating point, because you have both liberals and leftists who have sort of a critique of free market capitalism, different critiques, and a kind of similar critique of racism. And what they both share is that they can't really integrate those critiques or politics.
Right. Well, I think that in some cases they can. In other cases, they really, I think, genuinely believe, right, that, again, as I said, that if you adhere to a certain kind of colorblindness in your anti-racism, then you will reach a point eventually in which you have working class unity across racial lines, in which race disappears as a factor, right? It becomes literally invisible. And I don't mean to imply that there aren't black adherents to that point of view. My own grandparents were deeply committed integrationists who believed that, both not only that their mission in life was to join white institutions that were liberal and that were committed to an anti-racist agenda, but to create in their social lives and cultural lives, spaces where whites and blacks could come together and unlearn, in effect, the things that divide them.
This racial liberalism ideology really becomes the official governing ideology in Philly in 1951, when liberal patrician reformers win a new city charter and win control of city government. It checks the Republican patronage machine, and it also, in the same charter, imposes a ban on racial and religious discrimination in city employment, services, and contracts, and creates a commission on human relations to enforce it. Why did elite good government Democrats in Philly promote racial liberalism as part of a good government anti-machine agenda? And how did that good government politics in turn shape civil rights politics in the city?
So I think there's two things that were going on for them. Both, again, there's very prominent black and white liberals advocating this position, right? So one is ideological, that they are, this is long after World War II, right? They are true believers that a democratic society is a racially just society, and that the way you build a colorblind social order is not only that you legally bar racial discrimination, but you create opportunities for African Americans to demonstrate their equality, that they're no different from the white majority.
The breakthrough strategy.
Major focus of that is giving African American workers getting them into new occupations where they've been excluded from, or new occupational roles.
And then fellow workers and bosses will say, "Oh, wow, that was dumb of me."
Right. This is hey, black people can be tellers, or but the big deal was were the women who were the phone operators, right? That was a crucial, but also foremen, or extended all the way, across all different kinds of status lines, right?
Entire job classifications that wouldn't be obvious to us today, that were just whites only.
Yes, exactly. But it was also political, right? In the sense that this was what they needed to do in order to get black votes, and black votes were essential to ending the Republican patronage machine. So, and this is a case where self-interest matched ideology quite directly, and matched, frankly, this argument, liberalism's claim to be as anti-communist as anybody else, right? In other words, that part of the way to win the Cold War was to demonstrate that the American society could be fully racially integrated, that it could overcome its racial past.
To disprove Soviet propaganda.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, to prove that it's unlike the right, which was defending racial segregation, it's part of its Cold War politics, that this was a better, more effective Cold War politics,
right,
to pursue racial integration. And it was, they were reformers, but they're gradual reformers, right? So this is the other piece of it, right? So through the electoral system, we're going to change the city charter. We're going to be the first city in the nation to have a city charter that bans racial discrimination, not only in employment, but also in contracting, which is crucial to what happens later. But all of that, none of this is disruptive to either the local, capitalist marketplace, or to the political project of defending democratic capitalism against the Soviet Union, right? We're not tearing anything down. We're not disrupting American society. We're gradually fixing these minor problems that are left over from an older system, right? And so in that sense, they are gradualists. They're reformers. It's very technocratic, right? You institute a law. You set up a government agency. You hire professionals to adjudicate these cases. Their commitment is as much to educating employers and workers, white employers, of the fallacy of their racialist thinking, as well as advocating for black equality, right? And so it very much fits within the 50s ethos, the Cold War ethos of gradual reform as not only as preferable, right? You don't want to do anything disruptive, because the top priority has to be to defend democratic capitalism from the communist challenge. But within that context, liberalism can achieve important reforms that will actually help win that battle.
Revealingly, that lack of disruption causes big problems for racial liberalism's popular appeal. Racial liberalism has this big promise, and it really does deliver to some extent, particularly in opening up public sector work in Philly, like in other cities, and so building out what becomes a sizable black middle class in Philly. But ultimately, Philly's deeply racialized and unequal economic structure remains in place, and the expanding black ghetto in North Philly remained at its core.
And the thing is that what looks like a contradiction is, in fact, I think, the system itself, right? So why do black workers benefit from civil service reform so powerfully? Well, in part, it's because the pension system was, deeply racialized, and black voters matter, and so there's an appeal for Democrats to meet black voters' demands. But they also have, in fact, the reason they have a kind of structural advantage in the civil service system is precisely because they're kept out of the private employment system, which is a better paying system, right? So black workers actually have an educational advantage in competing for civil service jobs versus white workers, precisely because they're overqualified because they can't get into the private employment structure. And the same thing is true in terms of housing. Why is Philadelphia able to generate a black middle class, and my grandparents included, who bought their house in Germantown in 1944, on a block that had been opened up to black homeowners? It's precisely because whites are leaving, and so the real estate industry benefits if whites are leaving by blacks moving into these. So it's actually the racialism of the housing market that creates opportunity, just as it's the racialism of the private employment market that creates opportunity for employment in the government sector.
Well, how did that larger systemic and geographic reality of segregation and exclusion, both in terms of housing and jobs, how did that ultimately expose the limits of racial liberalism in Philly and lead a growing number of black Philadelphians to become disenchanted with it?
Well, here I think it's, the 2 points we just made. The one, the commitment to gradualism and to non-disruption, and then these structural factors in both employment and housing markets come together on that. Which is to say that one could have imagined a civil rights community that was both, in these what we now call NGOs, these nonprofit organizations, as well as in these government agencies, that was quite activist, right? Was very committed to confronting racial inequality in these housing markets and determined to push through very, very quickly. But what instead you get is a system which the Commission on Human Relations is literally called conciliation, right? They literally argue that when we find evidence of racial discrimination in employment, we're going to go to the employer and educate them and reach an agreement privately to fix the situation. And that notion, and the housing version of it is called neighborhood stabilization. When we have blacks buying into white neighborhoods and the white neighbors are upset, we're going to literally go and educate the white neighbors that no, your property values are not going to be hurt. No, these people don't want to marry your daughters. They literally said they don't want to marry your daughters. And we're going to convince them to stay, not to panic sell and not to flee. Now, to the credit of the Commission on Human Relations professional staff, by the late 50s, even they were admitting neither one of these was working. But that idea that it's enough to pass the law and then the law will be educational, and that you don't have to use strong government action to enforce it, creates this incredible contradiction where by the late 1950s, breakthrough jobs have not led to fundamental change in the employment market. Quite the contrary. One breakthrough job doesn't lead to anything else except tokenism. And in housing, the system, the white flight is ongoing, and the Commission on Relations essentially admits there are no integrated neighborhoods in the city. There are only transitional neighborhoods. And that once a block hits 30 to 40% black, there's nothing to be done. And as you can imagine, in some places, particularly in more working class parts of the city, where whites don't know where they're going to go and they're terrified about their only asset, a lot of tension that's generated by that. In other areas, people just move on. And I don't want to, being in Philadelphia, and I have to acknowledge that there's an exception to that, which is Northwest Philly, as well as parts of far West Philly, Overbrook and stuff, where at least for a while, white commitment to integration sustained something. But those are, the Commission on Human Relations says in the 50s, those are the exceptions that prove the rule.
Germantown and Westmount area.
Exactly. They are the exceptions that prove that rule. And so what you have is a growing understanding in Black Philadelphia that these laws and this agency are, they're not producing. They're not changing day-to-day life. They're not, the overall structure of the employment market isn't changing. Not only are are blacks still limited, most working class blacks still limited to ghettos that are, overcrowded, that have exploitative landlords, highly dense, and all these ways. But in fact, the urban renewal program is knocking these tenements down, and there's no replacement. There's no housing to replace it.
And the same goes for the city's public housing program.
Exactly.
It's reinforcing segregation. So not only can the city not prevent the private market actions and systems that are perpetuating segregation, the city's direct actions are perpetuating segregation.
Exactly, right. And what happens in public housing is not only do they give up on the possibility of integrated public housing or even scattered site public housing, right, where people could live in communities, but rather they turn to, as we know, the kind of warehousing of these high rises, modernist high rises. But then, of course, as the possibility of public housing declines, resources available to maintain them also decline, right? So they really become warehousing of the poor, of the black poor. Whites can find ways out, and frankly, black families that can figure out how to get out of that do the same, because they're not healthy communities.
I feel like what's most remarkable about this moment is that even a strong human relations commission, one that, let's say, was like guillotining offenders in front of City Hall instead of privately conciliating with them, that even they would have failed spectacularly, because you have industrial jobs and white people moving out of the city beyond the reach of the Human Relations Commission, and black people are making up an increasing proportion of the population of a shrinking city, 26% by 1960, 34% by 1970. And what emerges in Philly and really everywhere was this structural unemployment shaped by intensified segregation as you mentioned, as black people move into neighborhoods on the ghetto's edge and white people quickly move out. And you highlight the situation in Bucks County, which is a Pennsylvania county adjacent to Northeast Philly, one of the whitest part of Philadelphia then and now, I believe. And you have U.S. Steel, Philco, Rahm & Haas, these major companies all opening plants there. And black people don't live nearby, and not by accident. The massive whites-only suburb of Levittown was built in Bucks County at U.S. Steel's request to provide housing for their workers. So I guess my question is a fundamental limit that's exposed at this time, that solving these problems at the level of city government is just fundamentally impossible?
Yeah, probably. I think one could imagine that the city government would have done a whole lot more.
Totally.
Than it did. And in fact, the protest movements of the 1960s will force the city government to do a whole lot more. But yes, I think that's right. That what we see happening is that without a commitment to disrupting housing and economic in labor markets, right? And by disrupting, I mean having state intervention in those markets. And liberalism does not have that commitment, right? Liberalism sees its role versus the economy as countercyclical, right? Its role is to use public investment, to balance out, to prevent depression and to balance out inequities, not to actually direct that economy to be racially equitable or equitable in any other kind of way, right? As long as there's prosperity, the assumption is eventually it'll benefit everybody. And so you have, right, the situation in Levittown, where you have a major U.S. corporation essentially giving land to a major home builder, who says, "I'd love to sell to blacks, but my white market won't allow it." Probably not true, but it was a good line. And there's no recourse, right? Because the state doesn't have a ban on the state of Pennsylvania and the and the United States as a whole neither have a ban on discrimination in housing at that time.
Not till 1968 right? Nationally.
Not till 1968, right? And it's 62 in Pennsylvania, but even then it's so weak it doesn't do any good.
And it's still weak today.
Right. Well, and then we can see what's happened 50 years later. But so yes, I think that's right. That while even more robust Commission on Human Relations that was literally willing to deny contracts to builders or require, as they eventually proposed but aren't able to do, affirmative action hiring and say employers, would have made a difference. But it's not going to match the fact that, in fact, the textile industry collapses in the 50s in Philadelphia and moves to the non-union South. And these major employers are looking, right, to move to the suburbs. And this is, obviously Tom Segru's work on Detroit is the standard here for both productive reasons, so open space and modernized facilities, but also with at best total neglect of how that denies the opportunity, right, to address the racial inequities in their own workforce. If not, in fact, celebrating the fact that it's a way to preserve their all-white workforce in the face of growing activism for equity and employment.
Let's move on to the variety of Black politics that emerged in Philly with this growing disaffection with racial liberalism. You write, quote, "Inspired by the emerging Southern civil rights movement, this new generation of Black activists came to believe that only the mass mobilization of Black Philadelphia's working class majority could achieve real progress towards racial equality in the city. Ironically, the very same position that the by then discredited left-wing faction of the Philadelphia NAACP had taken a decade earlier." How did the explosion of the Southern movement from the 1960 Greensboro sit-in at Woolworth's onward, how did that provide such a massive number, really, of alternative models for struggle in the North? And how did those models fill the growing void left by racial liberalism?
So I think what's interesting, and what I had no expectation of when I started doing my research, is how quickly that the sit-in movement changes the dynamic in the city. I mean, literally in weeks. So the first picketing of Woolworths in Philadelphia is 3 weeks after the first sit-ins in Greensboro on February 1st.
Led by CORE.
Yeah. And more importantly, right, the selective patronage movement started by a minister in Philadelphia named Leon Sullivan begins in June of 1960. And the selective patronage, which is just a euphemism for boycott, right, was premised on the 1930s protest movement, the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work movement, against retail stores that wouldn't employ Blacks. But it takes that idea and targets employers in the city who are seen as discriminatory. And essentially, it's a workaround, right? They are giving up on the Commission on Human Relations precisely because it's unable or unwilling, right, to forcefully prosecute the case against discriminatory employers, and saying, well, if the government, right, the government we elected, if a Black votes, in other words, can't produce racial equity in the employment market, what about Black dollars? And so they build a 3-year boycott movement, again called selective patronage because they're worried about anti-boycott laws.
Starting with Tasty Cake, which is a very Philadelphia first target.
This is the brilliance of this strategy. Tasty Cake is not just a Philadelphia beloved snack company, but it's particularly important in the Black community at the time, at the corner groceries, all through Black neighborhoods, many of which were Black owned. And so this is a test, right? This is, can we in fact unite as a community? Or put differently, can the leadership of the churches unite the community to actually do something that's painful, right? I mean, in the sense that you can't send your kid in the middle of the afternoon in the summer to buy Tasty Cake. You're giving up something, right? I mean, I don't mean to overemphasize that, but you're giving up a convenience. You're actually putting the interest of the whole community over the interest of the guy down the corner who's got a store. You're trying to, the goal is to demonstrate that we are united. And so here's the other aspect of it, which is that this is not an interracial movement. They are not asking whites to do this. They're not trying to get white community. This is to demonstrate the power of the Black community, the Black dollar. This is intra-racial mobilization. And that's what I think is what's interesting and important about the emergence of protest movement in Philadelphia, and I think in other communities in the North, which is that, yes, they're deeply inspired by the Southern movement, by the use of nonviolent protest tactics, by the disruption of protest, right? Protest strategies. But there are two important differences in the North. One is that, and the more fundamental difference is that instead of trying to get the federal government to intervene on liberal grounds to protect the individual rights of Black citizens in the South, they're protesting against those very institutions, liberal institutions in the North, liberal ideas, for failing. They're saying you're not good enough, you're not doing enough. We are either going to, in this case, work around you and use black consumer power. And as we'll see coming next, we're going to directly protest you and your structures for not doing enough to demand more. And we're going to do that on an intra-racial rather than interracial basis. And implicitly, it becomes more explicit later, I think, that means the whole of the black community, which means the working class majority of the black community. So it's a very different kind of class politics there too. Anyway, so it's inspired by the Southern movement, but it understands the North is different. The context in which they're protesting is very, very different. It's very uncomfortable, right, for that civil rights coalition in the city, right, to suddenly, because the very agencies they built are now the target of protest, and that's a kind of crucial. I think to make that point, it's probably worthwhile to read what Leon Sullivan said at that moment, right, or we said about that moment, that the Philadelphia NAACP was one of the largest in the nation, and it did commendable work. In fact, he was a board member for it. But it could not move the giant enterprises, big business, to act on any significant scale. The Urban League was trying with some small success, but in proportion to the conditions, its efforts were negligible. Philadelphia had a commission on human relations, but it seemed helpless. It had no enforcement powers. I wrote to the mayor, but nothing happened. The same for the governor and the president. And to me, all the elements are here, right? The civil rights traditional system isn't working. The government agency designed to enforce this liberal model of racial equity is helpless. And I read that I wrote to the mayor, the governor, and the president. In other words, these people are supposedly, allied with the black community. They were elected with black votes. They're supposed to deliver, and they refuse.
You write, quote, "While not explicitly black nationalist, selective patronage prefigured the Black Power movement in its emphasis on the power of intra-racial solidarity and in the minister's conscious decision not to seek the aid of white allies." And it does really powerfully prefigure black nationalism. I mean, the campaign at the time was really politically capacious. It gets support from the, I think, sort of Maoist revolutionary action movement on the one hand, but it's led by Leon Sullivan on the other, whose trajectory is ultimately a really thoroughly capitalist one. In 1964, he creates the Opportunities Industrialization Center, this massive operation to train black people in job skills, but also create black-run businesses, including Progress Plaza, a mini mall that still stands today on Broad Street in North Philly, and then a number of businesses, I think, that ultimately failed, including a textile manufacturing operation, a chain of grocery stores, and an aerospace subcontractor. You write, quote, "Like Booker T. Washington, Sullivan believed that blacks would remain a dependent class until they became owners of property, businesses, and industry within their own community." How did selective patronage, the way it demonstrated the power of black consumers, one, and then two, the power of the ministers to control those consumers, how did that so quickly transition into this huge seminal black capitalism project that was both a model for LBJ's war on poverty and then something embraced by LBJ's Republican successor, Richard Nixon?
So that all speaks to the complicated nature of the black nationalist tradition, but also the complicated nature of the movement for desegregation, right? I mean, so the movement for desegregation, both North and South, is organized out of black churches that are essentially black-only institutions. And for Sullivan, there isn't a huge difference between organizing a consumer boycott campaign out of his all-black church and organizing a black capitalist investment, collaborative investment project out of that same church, which is to say that we tend to think of black nationalism through these racially separatist projects, whether it's Garveyism or the Nation of Islam. And of course, there was an important wing of black power that was black capitalist, right? So since there isn't these kind of binaries they don't manifest, they don't operate well in black community traditions. If we treat black nationalism in a capacious sense as about institutional autonomy at some level, right, then the black church is a black nationalist organization. Now, some people will, of course, roll over when I say that, because, of course, they're not nationalists in the sense that they're trying to create their own state, but neither was the Nation of Islam trying to create its own state, right? So there's just these are variants on this idea. So it was neither, Sullivan's notion of selective patronage was about inclusion in the society, but using Black solidarity, in effect, to push for full inclusion. And again, for him, that's what he was doing with Black capitalism as well, using solidarity, using a sense of our project. And he called his chain of convenience stores our markets, in order to win the citizenship rights that have, and not just not just on paper, but the full promise of American citizenship through economic activity. Again, in much the same way that Booker T. Washington. Now, not unlike Booker T. Washington, he doesn't eschew political action. He will become also a very important supporter of the first Black mayor in the city. He's a big advocate of Black political action, but his own focus is on essentially using consumer power and then collective investment power to change to buy into American capitalism in a more full way. So again, I think part of it is to not over dramatize the differences with more integrationist strategies, but rather to show that these influences are kind of overlapping. What is at play here, though, for Sullivan is a critique of the liberal power structure in the city and its emphasis not only on gradualism, but its tendency to focus on, again, to be stuck in this breakthrough strategy model, where they're more excited by middle class achievement and somewhat unfocused, if not just totally ignoring, about the realities of working class life. Now, and that so he has the same critique that Revolutionary Action Movement, the Maoist nationalist formation that also is emerging in the city, much smaller, obviously. They have the same critique of liberalism. His solution, right, is to argue that economic action, collective but capitalist, is what's going to change the realities of working class life in the city, as opposed to the radical Maoists' argument that the problem is capitalism and we need a revolution to overturn it. In 1963, those differences don't make it, or 1961, they don't make a huge bit of, they're not really that important. They will become, of course, obviously much more important as things go on.
I'm Naomi Klein. You're listening to The Dig, as well you should be, and you can support them on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com, and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. Verso just launched a new subscription service for readers to get ebooks and discounts every month. When you become a member of the Verso Book Club, you receive all of Verso's new ebooks every month, as well as one or more new books in the mail, plus 50% off all Verso books as long as you're a subscriber. To celebrate Verso's 50th anniversary, all member tiers are now at a discount of 50%. Choose between 3 membership tiers. The Verso Reader tier is a digital subscription for every new Verso ebook each month. Verso Subscriber, for 1 book sent to you in the mail every month and all Verso ebooks. And Verso Comrade, for 2 to 3 books sent to you by mail every month, plus all Verso ebooks. To celebrate Verso's 50th anniversary, each option is 50% off for your first 3 months. At this momentous time for global politics, Verso will bring you radical voices that challenge capitalism, racism, and patriarchy, debate the future of the planet, and work towards real political change. Sign up for the Verso Book Club at versobooks.com/book club. That's versobooks.com/book club. Another huge figure who doesn't fit neatly into these frames was Cecil Moore, who led an insurgent slate that took over the city's NAACP in 1962, sort of following the Popular Front era leftists in overthrowing the local NAACP's middle-class leadership. He borrowed from the Southern movement's militancy and mass mobilization, but differed in a lot of ways. You write, quote, Cecil Moore's mass popularity in Black Philadelphia's working-class communities sprang from his ability to synthesize the NAACP's commitment to institutional desegregation with a Black nationalist-influenced critique of the civil rights movement's alliance with white liberalism. He really fiercely attacked not only the white liberals, but very much the Black professional leadership, and was really provocative order. You write, quote, "A local version of Malcolm X, the only Black leader in the city unwilling to censor his words and actions to conform to white liberal sensibilities." He called two Black elites who he was describing as sellouts, quote, "part-time Negroes and Uncle Toms." And he said he was, quote, "the goddamned boss. I run a grassroots group, not a cocktail party, tea sipping, fashion show attending group of exhibitionists." Moore is just this incredibly consequential, idiosyncratic, and powerful figure who I think it's safe to say most Americans today have never heard of.
And yet in Philadelphia is still revered in the Black community. In fact, if you invoke Cecil, it's a very powerful political move today. The only person in the civil rights movement that's more known and who he, sort of like him is Robert Williams, the NAACP leader in North Carolina, who rejected nonviolence, called for self-defense, published a book called Negroes with Guns, and eventually was driven into exile because of his confrontations with the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina and then the FBI's intervention there. But Williams, in some ways, is a more conventional liberal than Moore, right? In the sense that he rejects nonviolence, but and Moore like Williams in that they both committed to desegregation, and Moore in many ways, particularly in the early period when he's most popular, is not really he's not a nationalist in that sense. He's an integrationist. He's very proud to be an integrationist. But Moore gets pulled to the left. Williams moves left and eventually ends up in first Algeria and then Vietnam and then communist China. Whereas Moore never does that. Moore is, in fact, Moore's a Republican. I mean, that's maybe the most important thing to know about him. He's a military veteran, served in the Marines in the late 40s, early 50s. Very much of that generation that, like Williams, had served in the armed forces, took seriously the belief that they were fighting for democracy abroad and thought that they had the same right to fight for democracy in it and to protect, and to use self-defense as a strategy at home. And so they see Gandhianism as a kind of betrayal of their Americanness and of their rights as men, as male citizens in particular. They see themselves in the tradition of the American Revolution. The right to use whatever means at their disposal. And this is, obviously it brings them closer to Malcolm X, right? Whatever means at their disposal to defend their rights as American citizens. I mean, Moore's a capitalist too, like Sullivan, but in a very different way. In the sense that Moore's an entrepreneurial, he's almost like a hustler, right? He puts himself through Temple Law School as a liquor wholesaler, right? He's literally works the city's bars, black bars, selling liquor, and that's how he pays his way through evening law school at Temple. Then becomes a criminal defense attorney, which means essentially he's protecting hustlers,
representing people jammed up in North Philly.
Exactly. And that's his base, as well as other, and one of his closest friends throughout all of this is Walter Rosenbaum, a bail bondsman, Jewish bail bondsman. And Moore will say things, and it's always hard with Moore to know what's calculation and what does he really believe, right? Part of his criticism of liberalism will veer into anti-Semitic language in the 1960s, but it's never clear why. Is it for drama's sake? Is it just because here he is with his best friend, right? And work in the city in all kinds of ways. But Moore, like Sullivan, comes from West Virginia. I'm not sure what that, except for they like each other because they're both from West Virginia. But they're sort of outsiders even to the Great Migration in the sense that most Black Philadelphians are coming from Virginia and the Carolinas, maybe Georgia. But so he's not beholden to any of those pieces, and he's an entrepreneur. But the one thing he hates are Democrats because the Democratic Party is the party of segregation in his mind. He politically, right, that he comes from a world in which there is this imagined idea, right, that the Republicans could in fact become the party of civil rights. There's no reason they shouldn't. They're the party of Lincoln, right? And in that sense, the party of small business ought to be the party of civil rights. And I think that's where Moore is. And he actually runs for Congress as a Republican in the 1950s. But he eventually, he's also, part of the NAACP, and he's very critical, again, beginning in the 1950s. And this is, again, because the NAACP leadership has also become very close to Black leadership of the Democratic Party. So they all become kind of one thing. And it's all to him about a kind of middle class, respectable, and what we've come to call respectability politics, so that he wouldn't have used that language. But this ethos that's more about creating opportunities for the best of us, right? The talented 10th, in essence, strategy, and not about delivering real change on the streets of, on his streets, on the communities in North Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, where working class lives are laid out. So again, like Sullivan, he is critical of liberalism for failing to deliver real change to the majority. But whereas Sullivan is, in fact, a member in great standing of the professional elite in town, Moore eschews, and he's a lawyer, he eschews all connection to that, right? He's as proud of the fact that he spends his Saturday nights walking up and down Broad Street from North Philly to South Philly, drinking and hanging out on the corner with folks, and not going to cocktail parties and not sipping tea like those, and for people who know Philadelphia geography, like those professional liberals on Lincoln Avenue in Northwest Philly.
He didn't go to cocktail parties, but he could drink.
Oh, could he drink? And he dressed better than anybody else in town because he wore silk suits every single day. So what he constructs, and again, it's never completely clear with Cecil how much this is intent or how much this is kind of improvisation. But he, once he gets the presidency, and he reaches the third time he runs of the NAACP, he is determined to bring both the protest politics of the South, but this class resentment at interracial liberalism, at the kind of, at what he sees, right, as this Black leadership's being more interested in making nice to the powerful in the city than in pushing for real change for the working class majority. And the timing is quite interesting, right? It's at the same point that Malcolm X is not only mobilizing this kind of critique as well, but also beginning to be frustrated at the Nation of Islam's unwillingness to engage in civil rights activism. And we see all these other elements within the civil rights movement beginning to express frustration with both nonviolence and interracialism.
And Malcolm X is a huge figure in Philly in particular. He's the minister at Philadelphia's mosque for quite a while.
In the 1950s. And so by this period, he's not there on a consistent basis. But yes, the Nation of Islam is very growing in the city, and what we know now, and I think was harder to understand at the time, the tensions between increasingly militant wing of the nation determined to bring this ethos of racial solidarity and self-defense into contact with the larger Black community, and a kind of older leadership that, was both more religious or millennial oriented, but also much more cautious about the power of the state to disrupt what they were trying to do, is at play inside the Nation of Islam as well, and quite well understood, I think, in the city. So Moore is picking up on a certain ethos. So even though he's never eschews ever in his career, and this goes to this commitment to desegregation and to racial inclusion, he begins to take advantage of this frustration with not just with liberalism, but also with Black middle class integrationism to build this very powerful base of support in Black Philadelphia, in Black working class Philadelphia, and to use that to build a protest movement against employment discrimination and educational discrimination primarily.
Yeah, so he is, despite all of these critiques of the liberal integrationist leadership, he remains deeply committed to desegregation. His first big campaign in 1963 targets the racially exclusionary building trades, which is a fight to stop the construction of a public school in the heart of North Philly, in the Strawberry Mansion neighborhood, demanding that more Black workers be hired, because these were publicly funded projects providing good-paying union blue-collar jobs that almost entirely went, and really to a somewhat lesser degree, I think, continue to go to white carpenters, electricians, steam fitters, etc. and more use these militant, old-school labor union-style picket lines, not the sort of demure picket lines we see today, but picket lines that directly physically confronted white workers and police. And it's a fascinating campaign, in part because of the strategic wisdom of choosing a target in the heart of Black North Philly. And then also because the NAACP targets these racially exclusionary labor unions, and in so doing, I think really goes after like a core contradiction of the New Deal coalition.
Well, that's right, and that's the point, right? Is that he was not critiquing the goals of integration, but rather the institutions that were claiming to be working towards integration and failing. And that, I think, is that's the ethos of the moment that he really captures. And I just sort of quick background here. So the Commission on Human Relations, the city charter bans discrimination not only in employment but in city contracts in 1951. 1953, the Commission on Human Relations announces it's investigating racial discrimination in the construction industry. The federal government also has on paper, an executive order banning discrimination in all construction contracting. And yet in the city of Philadelphia, the major construction unions are lily white. There was one Black electrician in the union as late as the late 1950s or 1960s, the electricians union. None in the roofers union, none in the steam fitters unions. The only strong presence of Black workers in construction was in the laborers union, the day laborers, which is the unskilled levels. In 1963, right at the beginning of these demonstrations, the head of the Commission on Human Relations, in effect, what they say is we finally are ready to say that the lack of Black workers on these sites is evidence of Negro exclusion. And this is the problem they have, right? Which is it takes them 10 years to investigate and to be willing to say this, announce this thing that is, a reality in everyday life for Black people in the city. Everybody knows this.
Because they're looking for a smoking gun of someone using the N-word and saying we're not hiring you because you're Black, basically.
Right. And so since the unions don't actually have a thing in their bylaws that says we don't take Blacks, but what they have is a thing that says you have to complete our apprenticeship program to be part of our union. The apprenticeship programs are federally funded, run by the Philadelphia public school system, and they're all there's no Blacks in them for these major construction unions. But they think that somehow if they do an investigation, they'll convince these unions to change. And it's only after 10 years they finally give up on that possibility. But by then it's way too late, right? And so when Moore comes along and says, look, they're not only are they building, are they have these contracts that we're excluded from for really good working class jobs. We can't get these jobs, but they have the gall to build a school in our neighborhood that's going to be an all Black school because of where they're putting it. And actually you're choosing locations for schools that are ensuring segregation in the school system, and they won't even let us build. They won't even let us work there. But this moment, which, one of the laborers says, it must be a false democracy if we can't get jobs building schools for our own kids. And so when he announces these demonstrations, and as you say, these are picket lines that are designed to, and they challenge these union workers, will you cross the picket line? And they also block supplies from being delivered. I mean, it is, and this is May of 1963. So it's the same month as the Birmingham protest with the fire hoses and the dogs. At the same time in Philadelphia, they literally shut down the city, in effect, with the demonstrations because there's so much mobilization.
There's a parallel mobilization at the Municipal Service Building.
Right. And so they're building also this downtown building, and there's just similar demonstrations there. And what is extraordinary, right, is that they obviously they blame the unions, they blame the contractors, but the primary target of the demonstrations is the Commission on Human Relations and the city government and the failure to enforce its own policies. And, by this point, the commission is saying, yes, we agree, in essence, we need affirmative action. It's not enough to ban discrimination. We need more than that if we're going to change the labor force. But they're either unwilling, and eventually the head of the commission will resign at this moment because he says the mayor won't back him. They don't have the power to force these powerful constituencies, the all white constituencies in that same New Deal coalition, the trade unions, to force them to change their policies.
But what Moore's NAACP ultimately wins isn't so impressive either. And the story you tell here is a tragic one about the breakdown in the New Deal coalition. You write, quote, To poor blacks, white working class Catholics, and Jewish and white Protestant professionals and business people alike, the city's liberal democratic coalition promised economic prosperity and a decline in social conflict. It is the paradox and ultimate tragedy of the 1963 protests that both sides would come to believe that they had lost. From that point on, Democratic politicians in Philadelphia would find it nearly impossible to find satisfactory compromise between the competing interests of their black and white constituencies. And you write that it wasn't just about optimism about improving race relations, but really, maybe more importantly, this more general and pervasive post-war optimism about growth and affluence. And we always think about that optimism shifting into this pervasive pessimism and sense of scarcity in the 1970s. But what your book really, and other books like it really show, is that it really was in the 50s and 60s that the feeling that one slice of a shrinking pie needed to be defended, that's when it emerged so powerfully in cities like Philly. So my question is, what does this conflict reveal about how black struggle and white racist reaction, how they both emerged within this seemingly zero-sum context of a city in decline? Because it seems as though, tragically, their interests really had become structurally opposed to one another, because construction jobs on publicly funded projects were really some of the last good pieces of a shrinking urban pie.
So, yes, that's exactly right. But I think also there's part of the problem is an ideological one in white communities that is older than that moment, right?
Right.
So it goes back to the 1940s and to the 1930s.
And to 1917, like we discussed at the top.
Right. But it's not just racism, which is also, goes back a long way, but this notion that my rights include the right to white-only spaces, right? My right to, I built this union, it has apprenticeship rules. Yeah, those apprenticeship rules favor my children, but that's as it should be. I bought a house in this all-white neighborhood or suburb. I earned that, right? And so this whole ideology that I worked for this wasn't given to me by the state, I worked for this, becomes a defense for not sharing it. And that's true. And that's one thing in moments of prosperity or in places of prosperity. What happens in a place like Philadelphia, where, right, the transition from an industrial to a service economy or a finance economy begins in the early 1950s, really, with the close of the Korean War and the departure of the textile plants, is that you said it well. It's a zero-sum game. There are only so many crumbs that one can get, and most of those crumbs are from the state, right? And that's the thing about the contracting system, right? Which is that this, the ideology says this is free enterprise. The reality is that the construction jobs, the growth industries, finance, insurance, real estate, these are all bound up in the state and state regulation. And if you're going to, you have to, political power is what delivers that opportunity.
What delivers the opportunity to work as a union electrician instead of at McDonald's. Exactly.
And whereas the promise to black workers from political power is racial equity and equal opportunity, the less explicit but deeply understood promise to the white trade unionist, white working class communities in the city is, you earned yours, you can keep it. And the way you keep it is through political power, right? And so, and this is what the construction protest, and before that, the long and ineffectual history of the Commission on Human Relations revealed, right, is that this is not a technocratic liberalism government that's fulfilling its promises. This is about ethnic politics and racial politics, and about the power to protect your community. And it's very clear that the Democratic Party, the power lay with the traditional working class elements of that party, not the liberal biracial middle class power, right? And that comes to a head in 1963 in the mayoral election, which happens right before the protest, right? Which is the Democratic primary in April, when having had two technocratic mayors, Dilworth, the mayor at the time, has resigned to run for governor. Resigned to run for governor a year earlier, and the sitting mayor, the city's first Irish Catholic mayor, which is pretty amazing about Philadelphia, is much comes out of this ward-based working class politics.
Mayor Tate.
James Tate, and he clobbers Walter Phillips, the liberal candidate, in that election. will go on to be mayor. And that's the moment in which, in essence, the fig leaf of middle-class liberalism is removed from the Philadelphia Democratic Party machine. And what we see is that where the power really lies is in these forces that are in defense of white privilege and white control over those over that pie.
The key figure in that reaction, in retrospect, is not Tate. It's Frank Rizzo, who in the early 60s, at the time of the 1964 North Philly riot, is the deputy commissioner of police. He led cops on the street during the riot. And as you write, Rizzo quickly, quote, became the focus of black anger about the persistence of racial inequities in the city and simultaneously emerged as the key figure in the resurgence of a racialist politics in Philadelphia's white working class neighborhoods that demonized black activism as the main threat to the local social order. It pains me to ask you to summarize so much in a couple questions because I could really and will probably one day do an entire show on Rizzo. But, he was named police commissioner in 1967 by Tate, as Tate sought to win over white ethnics moving right against a Republican challenge from the Law and Order Republican DA, who was Arlen Specter. He then becomes the iconic figure of white urban working class reaction when he's elected Philly mayor from 1972 to 1980. But explain Rizzo, his rise, and how Philly politics emerging out of this collapsing New Deal order, how it all polarizes around him.
So, Frank Rizzo, right, is a product of the intersection of this working class patronage politics in the city and the police. His father was in the police. And the way, this is from an era going back into, his father in the 1930s was a police officer. That goes back into the era of Republican patronage, where you had to be a Republican to get into the police force. The police force was dominated by the Irish, and Italians felt discriminated against within it. And that's the context in which Rizzo emerges. And I had black politicians tell me Rizzo hated the Irish much more than they hated blacks. I think that's not true. I think Rizzo was deeply racist, but it reflects the kind of complicated ethnic politics that's going on in this period of time. By the early 1950s, as Rizzo is rising through the ranks and becoming a precinct commander, he is notorious in Black Philadelphia for his violence and racism. He's known as the Cisco Kid because of the kinds of police brutality he carries out and his people who support him do. He is well known and detested in Black Philadelphia from very early on. What happens in the 60s, though, is this, he rises from being a kind of mid-level figure to first someone beloved as the defender of the rank and file patrolmen, these Irish and Italian and other ethnic groups, white patrolmen who feel abandoned by the liberal leadership of the city, and then eventually to their communities more broadly. How that happens reflects, a broad history about the police and that we're seeing, carried out here in the summer of 2020, which is that the rank and file has very little culturally in common with the reform management of these police departments, and that it becomes a kind of a culture, and not dissimilar to the kind of cultures of the unionism that played here, that believes in its way of doing things and it's the kinds of forms of solidarity it builds. Only this is solidarity built around use of violence, the ability, the dangers of Black communities, the need to use violence against them, and the sense that, either you support our prerogatives and our commitment to control, or you're against us. And, Philadelphia is the birthplace of the Fraternal Order of Police, one of the most vitriolic, conservative, and I would say proto-fascist of the police unions.
Lodge 5.
And Rizzo becomes the hero of that kind of rank and file police unionism as he moves up through the ranks. The first kind of key moment when that happens is the North Philadelphia Rebellion of 1964, which is a Black rebellion against police brutality. Police brutality in ways that I think if I were to rewrite my book, I would pay more attention to this. That going through the 40s and 50s, the other issue that's dominant in Black working class communities is police brutality.
Well, you write about Moore's campaign to desegregate Girard College, which we don't have time to get a lot of detail about, but you do write that is, even though it's about desegregating this home for fatherless boys in the heart of North Philly, what it's really kind of about is about confrontation with police.
That's right. And it's in that sense a direct result of the North Philadelphia Rebellion of '64, a year earlier. But if you go even back earlier than that, right, throughout the 50s, periodically, right, it's the mass meeting to protest the latest thing that they did, the police did, the latest atrocity. And that goes through, right. In the summer of '63, Moore leads a campaign to put criminal defense attorneys in all the police precincts in North Philadelphia to try to prevent a riot, because he's so concerned about ways in which the police are becoming so aggressive in black communities. And then what happens in the summer of 1964, the very same weekend that in Atlantic City, an hour and 15 minutes from Philadelphia, the Democratic National Convention is collapsing, over the demands of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the testimony of Fannie Lou Hamer. That very same weekend, there's a confrontation between a couple, a woman's pregnant, and the police, and the rumor shoots through the black community, heart of North Philadelphia, that the cops have killed a pregnant woman. It's not true. She turns out to be fine, but it's totally believable. And there are 3 days of rioting, and that are targeted, at two forces: the police and white, primarily Jewish-owned businesses in North Philadelphia that are seen as exploitative. It's a long story. I'll try to skip over pieces of it. But Philadelphia's police commissioner at the time, Leary, who based on this will go on to be the commissioner in New York City months later, right, does a kind of liberal approach to this kind of. He seeks to protect lives. He abandons property. He restrains the police. This is partly why it goes on for 3 days. And the police, the rank and file police, are furious. And the only person out there with them in their minds, telling them it's, this is terrible that you're being restrained in these ways, is Deputy Commissioner Rizzo. And he begins to develop this kind of folk hero status as a result of that.
He never gets too far up in the hierarchy to go out with his billy club and crack heads.
And he's always remains, his loyalty is to the rank and file, not to the politicians who are appointing the top figures. And the irony is that he uses that to actually get appointed the top figure. But before I tell that piece of the story, let me just point out the other thing that happens in the rebellion, right, is that people who are angry are, they're angry at everybody, including the civil rights leadership. Even Cecil Moore gets attacked, right? So he rushes back from Atlantic City, tries to calm people, and they start chanting, "We don't need no Cecil Moore. We got this under ourselves." And Moore, unlike all the rest of them, including Sullivan, is nothing but his pulse on his finger on the pulse. So that a day later, he's now attacking liberals for their failure around the rebellion and taking up the cause of the rebellion. And so, in that sense, he's not a new figure. But he and Rizzo both are lifted up in many ways by the rebellion and by the way they respond after the rebellion. And that's what leads directly to the confrontation at Girard College a year later. But most importantly to Rizzo's career is what happens in 1967, now at the height of Black Power, when this coalition of Black Power activists, which Moore has a kind of minor role in, builds a citywide Black student movement to demand more Black teachers, to Black history courses, a change in the dress code so that they can wear African-themed clothes, a whole series of changes to Black high schools, and organizes a citywide march on the school board in Center City, which is all managed. There's a whole set of negotiations with the liberal school superintendent that are taking place.
They have their representatives up in the Board of Education, and everything seems to be going well.
When the leaders show up, they're invited inside for negotiations. Actually, one of the high school students leans out the window and said they've agreed to 10 of 11 or 11 of 12 of our demands. We'll be right back with a full announcement. And then in that interim period, Rizzo shows up, still deputy commissioner, shows up with a new class of rookie police officers that he's just deputized at City Hall just 10 blocks away. There's one kid jumping on a car, and he uses that to initiate essentially a police riot on these high school students, in which he's caught on tapes with his bully club pulled, screaming, "Get their black asses." And the result is this extraordinary political moment in which the black deputy mayor, a man named Charles Bowser, believes he's convinced the mayor, Tate, to fire Rizzo for doing this. And Tate's out of town on vacation in Florida or something. But before Tate can get himself organized to get back to town to do that, there's a campaign organized. The switchboard at City Hall lights up, and it's just call after call, demanding not only that Rizzo's job be saved, but that he be promoted, and that he is the defender of law and order and racial calm in the city. Tate had just promoted Rizzo to commissioner before the election, which was that fall, in order to get reelected against Specter, as you said. And he thinks he can get rid of Rizzo now that he's been reelected. But this City Hall switchboard thing, he backs off. And 4 years later, Rizzo will be elected mayor on a conservative backlash platform.
Moving on to Black Power, which there's so many different organizations involved in your book. So like it emerges in Philly through this confluence of organizations and figures. SNCC, which, was one of the major organizations of the Southern movement in 1965, establishes an office in Philly and creates the Philadelphia Freedom Organization, modeled on Alabama's Lowndes County Freedom Organization. There's this Nation of Islam influenced SNCC veteran named John Churchville, who opens a freedom library emphasizing Black pride in education. There's the Northern Student Movement, which was founded by your father, Peter Countryman, a white man, and where your mother, Joan Countryman, a Black woman, also worked. There's North Philly's Church of the Advocate. There are all of these figures and institutions that ultimately lead to the rise of Black power in Philly, and particularly to the Black People's Unity movement. How did Black power politics and BPUM emerge in Philly, and how did they position themselves vis-a-vis the rest of the city's Black political scene?
So there's, I think, two things that are important about going on that you've laid out that are less about all the organizations, right, and more about the kind of group of people here, which is that this is a very much a youth politics, very influenced by the militancy and fearlessness of the Southern movement, but also its emphasis on Black leadership and on this idea of building, again, new kinds of leaders, not relying on the middle class, middle-aged traditional leadership, but identifying new forms of leadership in Black neighborhoods, in ways that are kind of simultaneous, right? You have the Southern organization, Southern movement, and SNCC, the Southern organization, beginning to kind of pull away from interracialism and question it and look for alternatives to it. And that kind of conforms to, at the same time, among young activists, some who come out of that tradition, and others who are kind of much more steeped in the Black nationalist street tradition, people who were like a man named Walter Palmer, who are very influenced by the Nation of Islam's Black nationalism, but not by its religious faith, right? They're not drawn to the Nation of Islam's version of Islam, nor to its kind of puritanical emphasis on clean living and rigid gender roles, etc. And these two kind of forces come together. They literally come together when John Churchville invites Walter Palmer to his library, and they begin a discussion group about the problems of interracialism and of nonviolence, and how to move the movement to the next stage. And that's what leads directly to the Black People's Unity movement being formed, BPUM, which was influenced in some ways also by a kind of internationalist sense, and they were very influenced by the emerging Black nations of Africa, right? The independent nations of Africa, and the notion of African unity. And obviously, their use of the word Black was also an early break from in terms of language. Palmer was a kind of organic intellectual from West Philadelphia who had been involved in efforts and critiques of the use of the word Negro that go back to the late 1950s, and again, this emphasis on Black history and those kinds of things. And so it all sort of comes together first in BPUM, and then SNCC's organization, the Philadelphia Freedom Organization, and actually the city's core chapter also makes this transition from being an integrationist, nonviolent organization to a primarily Black Power organization, all in the same period. But interestingly, and I think this is, it actually all predates the summer of '66 in many ways, the origins of this, or is simultaneous with it. And there's again a tendency to say, well, when Stokely Carmichael calls for Black Power in the March across Mississippi. This starts everything. Well, I think actually, no, it doesn't start everything. It just kind of reveals it to the world, what's been happening really in Black communities since 1963. And the other piece of it, of course, is the impact of first Malcolm X's being forced out of the Nation of Islam, and then his assassination, because as a martyr, Malcolm X becomes the model for an alternative form of Black political activism and leadership. And that's very much, so you don't have a kind of organizational link, but you have a kind of ideological and philosophical link there. And so that particularly this idea of community control that Malcolm X had been promoting, the goal shouldn't be to integrate ourselves into white neighborhoods and white institutions, but rather to take political and institutional control over our own communities. We're not trying to leave the ghetto. We're trying to control it. We should control its politicians, its social welfare organizations, its businesses. This is our community. We should strengthen it. And that's sort of the crucial thing that links all these folks. That the sense that what's wrong with our schools? There's nothing wrong with our schools. We should just run them. And if we run them instead of letting it be controlled by the white power structure, we will turn them into good schools. And that's crucial to Churchill's ideas in the Freedom Library, becomes a kind of key piece for all of the organizations I discuss in the book, is this idea of community control. And it eventually will lead to it leads to a lot of things. And there are radicals, there are important anti-capitalists, as I said, there's forms of Black capitalism. But in Philadelphia, it also is a direct line to the emergence of Black elected officials in the 1970s, in which they essentially say the Democratic Party itself, as it exists in Black communities, is an institution that we're going to take over and control.
Through the Black Political Forum, which is founded in '68 and wins first state legislative races, city council, Congress, and then finally in '83 the mayor's office with Wilson Good's election. How did the Black Political Forum draw on the Black Power tradition, which had a lot of problems in Philly in its few years of existence, the breakdown of the Black Coalition, which just becomes sort of dependent on, the very richest institutions in Philadelphia and falls apart, to more radical efforts, which encounter the reality that prizing intra-racial unity above all else doesn't work when it turns out everyone has extreme ideological differences. How does the Black Political Forum draw on the broader Black Power scene, and how did it hope to end what it called plantation politics in Philly?
Well, let me say two things first here. One is the other thing, of course, that the more radical forms are up against is state repression, right? And as from the very beginnings,
from Rizzo's cops in particular,
from Rizzo's cops, right? And so from the very beginning, like the Philadelphia Freedom Organization, the SNCC organization, which is wants to be a third party in the city, and it turns out they're sort of naive about how third parties work, and they don't really understand the machine. But by God, the police understand that they're a threat, right? And so here they are trying to build a political party, operate within the American political system, but have an all-Black political party. And not only are they harassed on a daily basis by cops, some of them masquerading as taxi cab drivers, but eventually they try to frame them with
for hoarding dynamite to bomb what?
Bomb City Hall, they claim,
wow.
Right? And it's and they're eventually forced out of town because...
And they get totally, the cops' case gets totally credulously covered in the media.
Exactly, even though, once it hits the courts, it's thrown out almost instantly because it's clearly... They don't even have ignition caps for the dynamite. It's so clearly a plant. Using, again, all the tactics we'll see with COINTELPRO. They find a guy who's got a criminal problem. They convince him to join the organization. He shows up claiming he's got this dynamite. And then before they can even get rid of the dynamite, they arrest them all, right? So that's the other piece of it. But so the
Panthers are brutally repressed.
Brutally repressed in Philadelphia. They come late to Philadelphia, and they are brutally repressed in the city. In contrast, the Black Political Forum and the politicians it begins to organize are not. They want to operate within the Democratic Party structure, and their argument is essentially they use the primary system to attack what they call plantation politics. The idea that the only way to get elected is to get the approval of the Democratic Party organization, which is called the City Committee. And that's all white. That's white dominated. So all of the Black politicians, by this point, most of the Black majority state house districts, the city council areas have Black politicians in them. or in the process of that. But they're determined. Who gets in those positions is determined by the Democratic Party organization. So starting with Hardy Williams, who runs for state house in West Philadelphia in 1968, they build an organization committed to running insurgent campaigns in the primaries, to developing the skill sets to win those campaigns. Right. So it's from the very beginning. This is not third party kind of running for political office to make an ideological point or to advance a political campaign. These are hard-nosed campaigns to win office, to win representation, and eventually the idea is to win state power, right? And Wilson Goode, who will become is as I remember the campaign manager for Hardy Williams' first campaign, and they have a platform that talks about a new kind of youth politics. They want to address rising gang problem through social services and through a kind of a mentorship system. They have a kind of very left liberal, borderline social democratic politics, which that's going to be again oriented towards the needs of Black communities, but very much within that spirit of community control. That we're not trying to integrate into white institutions. We're trying to deliver services to our Black communities more effectively, and we want to be held accountable by those communities. And Wilson Goode will say in the early 1970s that what we are seeking is community control over the Democratic Party infrastructure. And eventually he and the other members of the Black Political Forum will advance that strategy, that politics, to the point where Wilson Goode is the consensus candidate to be the first Black mayor in the city in 1983.
Yeah, so this ultimately all adds up to what became Philly's Black political establishment.
Mm-hmm.
Wilson Goode elected as Philly's first Black mayor, who then presides over the move bombing. 2 members of the storied Fatah family in recent years ending up in prison for corruption. Black independent leader Hardy Williams' son, State Senator Anthony Williams, finding himself aligned with corporate ed reformers. Congressman Lucien Blackwell's widow, former Councilwoman Janie Blackwell, recently defeated by a Black progressive. Did the Black Political Forum just become ultimately co-administrators of the same, if more diverse, machine?
So you'll actually be to know that's the book I'm working on now.
Cool.
Not about Philadelphia solely, but rather about that whole idea.
From Gary on.
And Cleveland on, yes. The idea that of using Black municipal power and taking as a form of community control, right? And the idea that if we control these institutions of growth liberalism, right? These publicly funded counter-cyclical institutions, and that we can then intervene using those levers of power in ways that will in fact advance the economic needs of the Black working class, right? That is the sort of central premise of what comes called Black independent politics within the Democratic Party. And part of my argument is that they'd already decided, that was the way to group before the Gary Convention. And so the Gary Convention's doomed from the beginning as not a kind of more aggressive, independent into Black power politics, but that this is in fact the most coherent version of social democracy that we see emerge in the country in the 1970s.
And sort of nationally reaches its apotheosis with Jackson in the 80s.
Well, see, the Jackson story is part of it. I mean, obviously, so Goode's elected in 83 and Jackson runs in 84, right? So there's a connection there. What's happened already, and of course, Harold Washington's elected mayor of Chicago in 83 as well. But by that point, the problem is already clear, which is that, of course, the country has moved to the right. The possibilities that they saw in the 70s for social democracy are collapsing around them. Whereas, so Goode, so the story about Goode is mostly about Move and about his inability to control a racist police force, and I think that's it's a tragic and horrifying story, of which he is both complicit and victim, I would argue. But in some ways, his crisis is much deeper, right? The crisis is that he does not have the tools or the resources to implement the social democratic agenda he's promised for the city.
He can't tax Montgomery County.
He can't tax Montgomery County. The wage tax in the city is driving out jobs. He can't, and the federal government, which was the central premise of this idea of community control, whether it's Coleman Young, sort of traditional liberal, or Richard Hatcher, the much more Black power influenced mayor of Gary, or Marion Barry, the SNCC veteran in Washington, D.C., all came to power on the idea that we can skip state governments and build a direct alliance with the liberal federal government and control the resources that come into our city and deliver in ways that the white plantation-oriented racist system had denied us, right? In those very struggles over construction jobs and other things. But instead, that's not who you're negotiating with. You're negotiating now with Jimmy Carter, who abandons growth liberalism halfway through his first term, and then with Ronald Reagan's entrenchment. Harold Washington and Jesse Jackson, in ways much more explicitly than Wilson Goode, run campaigns designed to restore that old order, the old New Deal order. The deep irony, right, that black politics becomes the last defenders of that old New Deal order. David Dinkins, I would argue, and I will in this book, attempts in essence to figure out how to build social democracy in one city without the federal government. And of course, he runs into the neoliberalism and the racism of Rudy Giuliani and only lasts one term. But this is the kind of tragedy of black urban politics, which is that its whole premise that it was going to negotiate with a white liberal New Deal state for power, it never gets to do because that state disappears in the face of conservative anti-tax and resurgent racist politics. And that, to me, is the fact that we can name all these forms of corruption or kind of entrenched do-nothing politics in which racial representation replaces social change, right? This is the ultimate tragedy. Black politics emerge out of the movements of the 1960s, but eventually become calcified into this idea that I represent you and deliver patronage in essence, right? And that's all. That's my sole responsibility, and you should celebrate that I've done that.
You write, quote, "It strikes me as historical wishful thinking to expect the advocates of black independent politics to have foreseen the massive rightward shift in national politics that would begin in the late 70s. And the same is really true for social movements in Philly, too. You write some really fascinating stuff about the Philadelphia Welfare Rights Organization, part of the National Welfare Rights Organization that was nationally led by George Wiley, and which is famously written about by Francis Fox Piven. But in Philly, it was led by this really remarkable figure named Roxanne Jones. And they won huge gains in enrollment and benefits, like shifting hundreds of millions of dollars, if I remember correctly, into the pockets of poor black women in Philadelphia and throughout the state. Up until Republican Governor Raymond Schaefer slashes payments in 1970. And then again, I don't recall, perhaps more dramatically, under Republican Governor Richard Thornburgh, again in the 80s. So were black freedom organizations in basically the same situation as the rising black political class in terms of them being founded in response to and amid the contradictions of the New Deal order, and so inevitably incapable of confronting the new right in power? And even if it was inevitable, as I think you suggest, what lessons might be learned today on the left in general and for black organizers in particular?
First of all, so one thing to say is the danger in that framing, I'll admit, is that it doesn't really follow the efforts to maintain a kind of progressive social movement that was in kind of a tension with liberal electoral politics or black electoral politics through the 70s into the 80s. And there's actually a book coming in the next couple of years by Austin McCoy that addresses that very issue in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago. And so particularly in the context of the 70s economic crisis and deindustrialization, to say that they didn't succeed is not to say they didn't try, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So there are really interesting experiments with trying to figure out how to maintain a movement politics with the kind of notions of social transformation and racial and economic equity in a very different economic context. The second thing to say is, though, that I wrote those things, and I admit this, right? I wrote those before Barack Obama was elected. This book's somewhat old, and certainly before Black Lives Matter. And so I think we're going to have to rethink sort of these notions about what happens in this fallow period, if I can be use a little bit of hyperbole, because of course there was lots of activism, some of which I participated in between 1975 and 2008 or 2013. But in a broader sense, right, we have to grapple with the relative, or the at best episodic impact of left-wing, of progressive social movements in that period. And I guess I would say a couple things, right? One is, again, goes back to this politics of scarcity. In a period in which the kind of political consensus was not only scarcity, but the need to pull back state intervention, and the shift towards a kind of free market economic competition in a globalizing market, when in fact the U.S. sort of imperial advantage of the post-war period has gone. It turns out that there simply isn't the kind of breadth of constituencies available to really push forward the kinds of political change and economic changes, or the real addressing of our political economy in that period that would have sustained the hopes of the 1960s. I hope that was clear, right? That whether it's growing conservatism in the white working class, both some of it racist, but a lot of it simply kind of almost kind of like defensive, I would say, but also the ways in which the benefits of the New Deal system had produced certain kinds of prosperity among New Deal voters whose children end up moving to the right and in really interesting ways.
And you have and kind of materially incorporating white ethnics as white.
Exactly, that's right. But it's also true, right? I mean, and there's been really interesting work done about this, the ways in which white, sort of professional class white liberalism becomes increasingly unwilling to support economic equity, right? So liberalism becomes identified. I mean, some people attack this as identity politics. I think that's less interesting than viewing it as, again, very rights oriented, very much focused in on access and opportunity, but not focused in on, or sort of largely ignoring or playing down the ways in which professional class people benefit from an increasingly unjust economic system. So I think there was a tendency, and I don't think I was fully to bemoan the failures of the next generation of political leadership in the Black community, as if they kind of voluntaristically failed, right? As opposed to suggesting they were unprepared for these both shifts in demography and political economy they just created a really hostile terrain for that work. And what we see in part with Obama, and I say this with some caution because he's obviously his economic agenda is really much more part of that neoliberal moment, but his racial politics and the ways in which certain constituencies respond to that, the fact that all of us thought there was no way that white America would elect a Black man as president, and the ways in which liberal communities responded to that. And then more importantly, with Black Lives Matter's emergence as, in fact, again, a critical response to the failures of Obama's the kind of post-racialism that kind of adhered to Obama's politics.
And the insufficiency of representation.
And yes, and the finding of a kind of politics that allows you to act on that. And I think that's perhaps the point, right? Because there's nothing new about it with the Black community saying political representation has failed us. That goes, I was working on that stuff in the late 80s and early 90s, but nobody could figure out or generate in fact, a lot of that politics was actually neoliberal, right? People say, well, we're going to use our consumer power to get the private sector to fund our programs and things like that. What Black Lives Matter and that kind of whole politics emerges is it begins to develop a re-articulation of the power of protest and of social movements, a much more critical relationship to electoral politics, and a new ideas about leadership that are deeply influenced, right, by not only key figures like Ella Baker from the 1960s, but also of the kind of critique of the limitations of a masculinist leadership. Some of which I try to talk about in my book. What's inspiring about this generation, which I am too old to really include myself, is the ways in which they refashioned a social movement politics that not only has remade race and the way race operates, racial politics of the moment, and where obviously it's going to go one way or the other in a few months, but also forces us to rethink the history of social movements, not only of the 1950s and 60s, but of this fallow period in between.
Well, Matthew Countryman, thank you very, very much.
Well, this was a great pleasure. And thank you for remembering my book. It's nice to be remembered.
Matthew Countryman is chair of the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, where he is also a professor of Afro-American Studies and History. He is the author of Up South, Civil Rights and Black Power in Philadelphia, and he is currently working on a book on the role of African-American mayors in national debates on race and poverty in the late 20th century. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said after noting that the police, the judiciary, and the administration are not deputies of civil society itself. Rather, they are office holders of the state whose purpose is to manage the state in opposition to civil society. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We are posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Julia Rock and Zachary Nin. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it is on iTunes, you can also leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you telling your friends about the show. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to keep this podcast up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.